All right, so Becoming a World Power Part 4, we just looked at the Panama Canal. We're going to be looking at some other U.S. policies post Spanish American War and our influence, especially with Teddy Roosevelt as president, because he was a very influential figure. But what you're getting into is the progressive era. The election of 1904, the Republicans were going to nominate Teddy Roosevelt for his own term. Remember, he became president when President McKinley was assassinated. One reason he was there was because a lot of the Republicans didn't like him. They thought he was too noisy and pushy, and so they thought by making him vice president, he wouldn't have any real say in the party. Well, then McKinley gets shot, and Teddy ends up as the leader of the party. So that plan backfired on him. There's Teddy at a rally giving a speech and talking to the crowd. The Democrats, they nominate Alton Parker, who was a very conservative judge. TR wins the Electoral College 336 to 140. He wins the popular vote by 2.5 million, which is pretty much a landslide in that time period. And again, there's the electoral vote. You can see the Solid South still voting Democrat because they're still mad about the Civil War, now 40 years old. So Teddy Roosevelt, and when it came to dealing with foreign affairs, he's very aggressive. Right? His major quote of the time period was "Speak softly and carry a big stick." And to him, basically the big stick was the U.S. military, and in particular the U.S. Navy. There's a cartoon from the time period of Roosevelt standing over all the other countries, trying to be a police officer between Europe and the other countries of North and South America. It becomes known as the Roosevelt Corollary, but in a speech given by Roosevelt, he adds on to what Monroe had said about colonization being over. And he said, well, if things are wrong, if something's wrong in the Western Hemisphere, the U.S. could use force, but no one else. However, it was not for territorial gain. We would do it to keep the peace, and then if we had to invade a country, we would eventually give them their independence. We weren't going to stay there like the British would. 1904, of course, we know he secured the right to build the Panama Canal. Already been through that. 1907, he sends the Great White Fleet around the world, that modern U.S. Navy, just to kind of show how powerful the U.S. had become. And there's a picture of the white battleships. He had them painted white so they'd be easy to see on the ocean, steaming around the world, so making stops in different cities just to show just how powerful the U.S. had become. On the domestic front, TR was also very aggressive. The Progressive era was a big reform era because of all the problems with the big businesses. One of the big ones comes in 1906 with the publishing of a book called The Jungle. And basically what it showed is how unregulated the food industry was, with all these people living in cities and dependent on buying their food. Upton Sinclair, who wrote the book, went undercover working in a slaughterhouse in Chicago and wrote about the business. There's a picture of a cover of one of his books. But basically, there were no bathroom facilities for workers. There was no real cleaning. The food was not taken care of. So, it was just very, very messy. And so in 1906, Congress passed the Federal Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. And now so companies that provide food for people have to meet minimum standards, and they're inspected by government workers, agencies, to make sure that they are doing that. He was also known for using the Sherman Antitrust Act, the first president to do so. If you remember, we talked about that being passed under President Harrison in 1890. He sued the Northern Securities Company, which was a big financial business, the Standard Oil Trust, John Rockefeller, we talked about that, the American Tobacco Company. All of them were sued and eventually broken up under the Antitrust Act. Other companies he threatened to sue and got what he wanted from them. Carnegie was one of those guys. The election of 1908, TR decides not to run again. He made a promise in 1904 that if he were elected, he would treat it as his second term and would be done by 1908. And he really regretted saying that because he would have loved to have run again in 1908, but he wanted to keep his word. I know, unusual for a politician, right? But he kept his word, and so he does not run again in 1908. Right? So instead, the Republicans nominated William Howard Taft. And there's William Howard Taft. The Democrats nominated William James Bryan. There's Bryan. Taft ends up winning 321 to 162 in the Electoral College and by 1.2 million in the popular